I've been working on a project to create a custom checkout page using Stripe and Nuxt.js. While going through this process, I found a lot of things I wish I knew beforehand that I want to share with you guys, and some tips on how to create a custom checkout page. We're going to go through it step by step. For the back end, I tried a couple different ways. I used Nuxt with API routes, which I'll show you, but I also found another way to do it through AWS, which I think is actually a little bit better. So I will show you guys how I set that up and how powerful that is. So let's take a look at how this will work. So here is the custom checkout page that I've created, and it's for a video game called Donkey Kong Country that I used to play way too much when I was a kid. And we'll assume that you already added this into your app and into your cart, and this is the only item that we'll be buying today. Now, you see here I have a bunch of fields, and then right down here I have a way to do multiple different ways of paying. So I can pay via card, Visa, MasterCard, American Express, Diners Card, or I can do Google Play. I didn't set this up in this demo, but you can add Apple Pay in here too very easily. So let's see how this works. So I'm gonna put in my name, Erik Hanchett. I'm Erik at example.com, 123 Erik Street. And I'm just gonna leave it on card. And then I'm gonna put in just a fake card that you use with Stripe. I'm gonna put in my CVC, and then I'm gonna put in a zip code. And when I hit enter, it actually thinks it's a real credit card. I'm hitting no thanks. It's going to send this information over to Stripe and receive a payment, success payment. So it says here, congrats, which is great. Now, in the back end, I wanted to make sure I saved this data. So I created a DynamoDB database right here. And I have it connected so that it will automatically create a record after the successful payment. That way, as a user, I know where to ship this as the person that owns the game, I know where to ship it to. So I created this record right here, Erik Hanchett, Reno, and this is all automated through hooks. So this is essentially what we're going to create today. I went ahead and opened up a new Nuxt app using Nuxt 3, and I did some configurations off camera that I want to show you and how this app is going to work. So first, I installed, if you look at our package.json, I installed two different Stripe libraries. The first being the Stripe JavaScript library right here, and the Stripe library right here. So just think of this Stripe JavaScript library as the one you want to use on the front end, and the Stripe library is the one you want to use on the back end. And that's the way I did it. I also installed AWS Amplify, which is a little bit of tooling that we're going to use later. You don't have to use this, but this is nice, especially when you're using AWS services. But like I said, I'll show you how to do it without AWS and then with as well. And then to do a little bit of configuration, if I go into my Nuxt config, I created a .env file. So I'm not going to show you my env file, but it has a few things in here. It has my Stripe secret key, the endpoint secret, and the Stripe key. And if you're inside Stripe itself, so I'll show you, if you go here, make sure you choose test mode, but you can go in and essentially create your keys. So if you go API keys right here, it's going to load them up. Now, these are some test ones that I created in the past, but I can also get my secret key. And I went ahead and created these beforehand. And the most important ones you really want is the publish key and the secret key. So I created a .env file and put them in. Now, there's one more here that you see is endpoint secret. And the way this works is if you go into webhooks here, go developer webhooks, this essentially tells Stripe that after a payment is completed, where to go. So it essentially tells it that you have an endpoint that will look for events that come in when payments are completed. And I put some ones in here. There's a couple of ways you can handle this inside Stripe. One is you can add the hosted endpoints in here. Another way you can do it is they have a really simple Stripe CLI. So what this Stripe CLI does is you can have it point to an endpoint. So if you didn't want to add them in as a hook inside the webhooks, you can use the CLI just for testing purposes. So on a separate computer, I installed the Stripe CLI. I ran this command, the Stripe listen forward to localhost. So I am forwarding this over to my endpoint, to my backend, so that way I can test endpoint to make sure that the events are going to my DynamoDB database. Another little bit of housekeeping. is since I am using Amplify, I created this this plugins folder, Amplify TS. And this is essentially how I defined my plugin. By the way, I'll put a link to this repository in the description. So if you're following along, go ahead and check that out and you can see exactly what I did. But what I wanted to do is I had this endpoint. I created an API gateway and then this points to it. And that way Amplify is configured correctly. That also had a little bit of additional configuration. I had to add in this alias, SSR, and Vite global. This is all in the Amplify documentation. So this allows you to use Amplify inside your Nuxt project. Moving on, we can look at our index view file. So I created this new checkout component, which I'm going to be using throughout. And so this page right here basically is the whole checkout component. So you're probably wondering what the style is, this NES style. I really like this. It's kind of a fun CSS library you can install. If you look inside this app view, I just added in a use head and then I just linked to the style sheet. And there's two style sheets you need. One is this NES min and then this API for press start 2P. And that makes it so it kind of gets to this blocky lettering. And also you can see it change the cursor to this hand. So here is my checkout page. So I want to show you how you set this up. So I have script set up. I have language equals TypeScript. So the most important thing first is I had this onMounted hook. And what I want to do is as soon as this checkout page loads, I want to do a little bit of loading of our Stripe. Now I went ahead and added in all the NES styles and all these inputs in. So you can see here I have a field set, and then inside the field set I have these labels and inputs for everything. So nice and accessible. And then I have these CSS, which is for the NES fields themselves. And then down here I have a loading button. And you can see right here, payment element. This is where we're going to mount the payment element so that way someone can pay using a credit card or Google Pay or Apple Pay. So as soon as the app loads, I'm gonna run this onMounted. And first, I'm gonna import a few things in. So I'm gonna import in Stripe elements, and load Stripe from the Stripe.js JavaScript library. Remember, this is the one we want to use if we're going to be using on the front end. And then I'm going to create a few variables, one called Stripe, one called loading, which is going to help us with loading, and one called elements. And this is where we're going to have our Stripe elements. And Stripe elements are kind of the building blocks of our CSS and HTML that will create the inputs for the credit card. Now, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use this config public Stripe. So there's this load Stripe, which if you see here, I have it from this JavaScript library, and I just pass in this public key. Remember, if you're using Nuxt, to get environmental variables, you have to use this use runtime config. So, and you have to have the variables inside the Nuxt config. So I'm going to load the Stripe key. Next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to load the elements. And I have to put a mode payment, a USD, and amount. Now, having the amount hard-coded into your front end is a very, very bad idea. But for the sake of this demo, we're going to do it. Really, though, there is a different part of this process where we get the payment intent from Stripe. And in that case, we actually look up the product and the price. So don't think about this as something that a user can change, because later on when we're working with the backend, we do make sure that the price is correct. You can also do a call right here to grab the information if you needed to, but I'm just going to assume for right now we'll just leave it as $19.99. Then we're going to create this payment element. So this right here, this payment, it creates this payment element, and right here it mounts it onto this payment element. So this is basically CSS. This is an ID selector for payment element. Remember back down here, we created this div with ID payment element. So this will mount it at that spot right there. And then we're going to put loading value false. So as soon as the app loads, loading is true, meaning that we can't hit the button to purchase something because it hasn't been loaded yet. But then we set it to false right here. And this is what will happen if we save this, and we'll run this locally. You see right down here, it's loading, and now it's all available and everything's working fine. So let's take a look at how we would handle a submission from this form here. So right now I have this form handle submit, and I have all these inputs. So first I'm going to do is if it's loading, I just want to return. So I don't want to accidentally have someone submit while the form is still loading. Then I also check to see if Stripe has loaded or Elements hasn't loaded. So if Stripe hasn't loaded or that Elements hasn't loaded, then Stripe hasn't loaded yet, and also I want to return. And now I need to do a couple of different things. First, I'll put loading value equals true. So we want to start this loading process. That way someone can hit the submit button a bunch of times. And then we want to grab all the values out of the forms. And there's a couple of ways of doing this. Now, typically, like in React or in Vue, you can set V models on every single input. And that's kind of the way you see most people using this in Nuxt or Vue 3 app. I really like the idea though, since we are using HTML and we're using a submit and we have an event object, is to grab the values directly out of the event object. And so I use this from entries right here. And then I grab the data using form data out of it. And that way I can get every single value out of the form. Just beware if you use this and you're following along that the inputs that you have in here, you need to make sure that they have an ID. Otherwise this won't work correctly. So now I'm going to create, there's two steps here. So I need to create a payment intent, and then I need to submit the payment. And I'm going to do this all in the handle submit. Some people, if you look online at other tutorials, they may do this a little backwards. They may, as soon as the page loads, they create the intent. And then when you actually click purchase, that's when they'll purchase the card. I like to do it all in the handle submit, but it's up to you. Leave a comment below if you have a different way you like to do it. So first I'm going to do a response. Now I'm using this API.post. This is a part of the Amplify library. You could do this for fetch as well if you like. It's just essentially the same thing. It's just going in and doing a post to the Stripe purchase. I'm going to send this product, which is the product ID. Now before I started here, inside Stripe itself, you can create products. So I went to here, I'm still in test mode. If I go to products, you can click add product. And so I added this product right here, this Donkey Kong Country Super NES. I filled this out, and then I grabbed this right here, this JFG. This is the same thing as this right here, this JFG. So you grab it from up here, and this is the ID that you'll use. And so I'm going to send that to my backend, which I'll show you in a second how that works. And I'm going to console log the response. And what happens is the first step of working with Stripe and using a custom checkout form, you're not actually forwarding the user to Stripe, which you've probably seen at a lot of different places, since you're doing everything in your own front end. You first get the payment intent, which gives you this client secret. So you'll send this back from your back end to your front end, and you'll need to use that later on. And then I also will get an error. So if there is any sort of errors, like let's say they forget to enter in a value, it's already built into the payment form that you can grab the data out, and I can set loading false and then return out so we don't do anything else. Then we're going to do the confirm payment. So as long as there was no errors in the submit form and that our payment intent, everything worked correctly, then we're going to go to the confirm payment. And what we need to do here is we have an object. We need to pass in a few things. First is the elements that we created earlier. That secret we got from our backend, which I'll show you how to create in a moment. And then a few confirm params. So this is information that's going to be stored in the database. That way we can retrieve it later on with our hook. We're going to grab the receipt email. We're going to grab a shipping address, which is a city. And by the way, this is all typed, so if you're typing this out, you can see everything you need to put in there. We're going to add a line 1, a state, a postal code, a US country, and then a name. And you're probably thinking right away, this is weird. Why are you casting these all as strings? Well, one issue of doing it like this right here with the object.from entries is these are form data entry values instead of strings. I could have set an interface up right here so I didn't have to do this later on, or I could have gone back to using V models. But for the sake of what I'm trying to do now, I'll just leave it and I'll just cast it as strings, which works. And then you can enter a return URL, which allows you to switch to where you want. Since I'm just running this in locally, I'll just put it to success. And then I'll change the loading value to false. And then I need to do a couple of things. This right here, this confirm payment is going to return back an error. And I can check to see if that error, if there was an error. So one thing nice about Stripe is they give you credit cards that are not going to work and that will return errors. And if you use one of those, I just want to make sure that path fails, essentially. So I have this big router here, or this if error type card error or validation error. I'm going to push to the error route. Otherwise, I'll just do console log great. And then I have another, this is a part of a big try catch block. So if anything breaks through this, it'll go to this error route as well. And that's essentially it for it. So first steps, we create the payment intent, we grab the secret from the back end, and then we run confirm payment. And we pass everything we want into that confirm payment. So that way in our webhook side, we can use that and be able to save that information to Dynamo. So I created 2 API routes, and let me show you how that works first. So inside Nuxt, you can create a server folder, and inside the server folder, you create an API folder. And I'll have 2 routes. One is the one that this one's going to hit. So as soon as you submit your information, well, as soon as you try to create a payment intent, you need a backend. And that's what this API call here is, where I'm doing this API call right here. Like I said, you could use fetch, basically does the same thing. And then the webhook is how you're going to grab data after it already completes. So let's take a look at the Stripe one first. Let's just look through this line by line. So once again, remember I installed the Stripe library, the npm I install Stripe, and this is what I'm going to use in the back end. Now, what's really important since I'm using Stripe in the back end is that I'm grabbing the secret key, the Stripe secret key from my process.env. Since I'm using the back end, I can just go directly use process.env. Unlike checkout, you may have noticed that I'm using this hook, this use runtime config. But since I'm in the back end, I don't need to use that. I can just go directly to process.env Stripe secret. And one other little thing, when you're setting up your secrets, the public ones you have to kind of preface by public here, and then the ones used on the server are just on the main key value of the runtime config. So make sure you don't mix those up. You don't want to put your private keys in public. Grabbing the data from the Stripe, I'm doing a price list. So I'm using the API from Stripe to just grab that one product ID. And remember, in the front end, I'm sending over the product ID. So I'm grabbing it here using read body, which is the preferred way in Nuxt to grab data from the body that's being sent over. And then I'm running this price list on it. This basically just returns the one value. But if there's something wrong with it, like for some reason it couldn't find it, then I just return. And then I'm creating the payment intents. Remember, this all has to be done in the back end. You never want to do this in the front end. I'm creating this payment intents crate, and then I'm passing the currency, the amount, the currency. I just put some dummy data in for metadata, but you can pass in as much metadata as you want for the customer and then retrieve this later in the webhooks. And then automatic payment methods, I need to put this enabled true, and this allows you to have like multiple payment methods that you have set up in Stripe. If you go to payment methods, you can see I'm in test mode right now, but I can add in more payment methods. Like right now I have my credit cards, but I can add in, I can turn on Alipay, I have Apple Pay, Google Pay, and a few others. Google Pay, Apple Pay won't show up unless you do some more configuration with Apple Pay, so I didn't show you that, but I can turn on all these, and all these payment methods will show up in Stripe in my video game store I just created, which is really awesome. So the last thing I do is I just return it. So it's Nuxt by convention is smart enough to know to JSON, to send this as a JSON object back and attach the correct headers, which is awesome. So I send the secret, payment intent, client secret, and then if there's an error, I throw an error on the console. So that's essentially how I do it with using API server routes. Now, one thing which is really nice is I can do webhooks as well. So this allows you to capture data as soon as a payment goes through. And you do it the same way. You do new Stripe, you pass in the secret key. In this case, I need to grab the headers from headers. And this, if you're using a webhook, this just verifies that this actually was from Stripe and that it wasn't from someone trying to trick your backend that a payment went through. So it grabs the Stripe signature. And then I had so many problems when I was first doing this. I didn't realize that there's something called read raw body. And this is the way you grab the body that you'll need later on to run this construct webhooks event. The reason I mention this is if there's a read body, if you use read body, this will not work. And I spent like a half hour trying to troubleshoot why I couldn't create this in the first time. It's because you have to get the raw value and you have to use read raw body, and it wasn't documented that well, I don't think. So I created a variable called hook event, and then I constructed the event, and you pass in that body, once again, that I got from this read raw body. You pass in the sig, which I grabbed from the headers, and the endpoint secret. And as I was describing before, this endpoint secret is grabbed by two different ways. You can grab it either by adding in, going to developer webhooks, putting in the URL of the webhook directly in here, and it's going to give you that secret key, and then entering it into your app. Or, like I said, you can use the CLI, which I'm doing right now on a different computer, or you can use this Stripe shell by pushing the tilde key and then adding it in there in the website. Once you're logged in, you can do that, which is really cool that they can do that. So as long as this works and it doesn't throw any error, then this is where you can look through the types. So you can, as soon as the payment intent is created, you can do something or succeeded. But the one you really care about is the charge succeeded. So this hook event dot type that comes back from this construct event, this is where you want to do everything. If you look at this object, here's something you do. If you look at this charge succeeded, it goes to hook event.data.object. You see here there's no types. So a trick you can do is you can do as stripe.charge, and then you'll have the correct types. I don't know why it does that. There's a GitHub issue on this. I should check with someone on Stripe. I think eventually they're going to add it. But here you can see all the different types. So you can take any of these values and then have them saved in a database somewhere. So this is what I did. So let me show you the alternative way of creating your back end using AWS and using something called CDK, which I think is really powerful. So what you can do is CDK allows you to create infrastructure as code. And if you'd like to get started today, by the way, there's an AWS free tier. You get over a year for free, and you can try all this out. And by the way, everything I'm using today, I'm not even on the free tier. I work for AWS, but I'm using my personal account, and I get charged like 30 cents a month. And I create apps like this all the time, by the way. Just a few bucks a month. I think I'm like at $1 now. So to get started with CDK, if you've never used it before, CDK before, you can run this command. You can run this command npx cdk init app -- language TypeScript. This is assuming you have Node installed, and this will create a brand new CDK app for you out of the box. And then in that, it'll give you some folders here. On the right hand side, you see you have a live folder, and then you have this functions folder that I created. But what you can do is you can create multiple stacks. So if you want in-depth information on this, I'll put a couple links in the description, or let me know in the comments. I could do a whole video on this. I find this fascinating. But essentially what we want to do is we want to create a back end that can take our payment information to charge the payments, but also webhooks. So we don't have to use the Nuxt server routes, and then we can have the full flexibility of AWS. So in this example, I have the CDK Stripe app, Stripe.js, and so I'm creating a few stacks. And think of a stack as a set of components or a set of backend services. So first, I have a database stack. Then I created a stack for my basically Lambda functions. And then I created an API gateway stack. And then I created an Amplify stack. So if we kind of go through each one, I'll show you some highlights of it. And like I said, you can download this whole repository. I'll link in the description. But let's look at first the database stack. So all I'm doing is I'm running this dynamodb.table. I'm telling it to create a new table with a name, with a partition key, with an ID, and it's going to be a string. And then I'm also telling it, hey, we're going to use this later in the app, so have this as a property on this class that we can access elsewhere. So just with these, I don't know, 4 or 5 lines, this creates a DynamoDB table. And so that's the first stack. The second stack I created, I believe, was this Stripe stack. And what this one does is it creates the lambdas. So first I created some secret keys. I'm using Secret Manager. And then I'm using the Stripe webhook lambda. And what this does is it looks in this function Stripe webhook folder, and it takes the code in there and it adds it to this lambda. And I can add some configurations. And this is all typed, by the way. I'm telling it use node 16. The entry point is index.handler, and then I'm sending it some environmental variables. And then I create the Stripe purchase lambda. So this is the webhook lambda and the purchase lambda. Same thing we saw with the API routes earlier. And then I just do some granting. That way this secret key, I'm using Secret Manager, has access to the lambdas, and the endpoint has access to the lambda too. And then the gateway, this creates an API gateway, which I think is a really powerful way of handling your API. So you can have this layer in between that you can add in a firewall. You can also track every single request to your API. It's kind of a middle layer between your API on your application and the internet. So this creates a new API gateway with a REST API, description, deploy options. And then I put some default cores, which allows all methods. And then I add the 2 variables in here, which is, well, basically I create 2 new resources, one for the Stripe purchase, one for the webhooks. And then I have these lambdas. So essentially this creates a /Stripe purchase and Stripe webhooks on my API gateway, and then it connects directly up to the lambdas. And I added this post, which means that you can post to it. That's the type of API method that we're using. And then finally, which I think is most interesting, is this Amplify app. And I have this test key, this public test key. This is not anything private that I have on here. And this creates a code repository inside AWS Amplify. And I just need to, I'm using this Amplify app. And by the way, I'm using this AWS CDK Amplify Alpha. I had installed that separately. And this repository I created beforehand, I push it up. I have this Erik CH, and then I have an OAuth token for GitHub token. So this, once again, I had to go into the secrets manager inside AWS and add a GitHub token, which you can, if you're just interested, you just look up secrets manager in the console and you can add a new token. And I used it as plain text. And this is all you need to do. And then I added add branch, which means anytime you push up to the main branch, it automatically provisions the site, or it pushes up the site to it. And you can add multiple branches, and you can, this is JavaScript essentially, so you can add a whole bunch of more configuration if you want in here. So this right here allowed me to create the infrastructure for this app. It looks a little intimidating when you see this 4 different files, but it's pretty straightforward to get through. And like I said, I'll leave this example up if you guys want to learn it even more. Now, the functions I created are going to look similar to the ones I did before. So this index.ts file, this is this hooked up to that lambda we created earlier. And it's a little bit of different syntax, but it's essentially the same thing we saw before. I'm creating I'm grabbing the secrets, and I can't grab it from process.env. So now I'm using the secrets manager. I'm grabbing the value out of it. And then I'm doing this new Stripe key. And then I'm also checking to see like if there's a problem with the body, like there's no information, no one posted it, it just returns an error. But otherwise, I grab the product ID out of it. And then I run this Stripe list command like I did before. I did this filter just in case more than one product came out. It always returns 1, but you have this possibility. You might need to use it. And then I create the payment intent exactly like I did before, with passing in the unit, the data, the amount, everything I need, this dummy data, and then I pass back the secret. And also I do some cores right here because I'm using the Lambda as a proxy. So I have to make sure I have the correct headers back. This really tripped me up at first because even though in my CDK I had default CORS options, but since I'm using this Lambda as a proxy, I still had to send back the headers manually. If you know any difference, let me know in the comments below. And then I sent over the payment intent. So that's how I did the purchase. And if I go into the webhooks, which I think is right here, Stripe webhooks, I do basically the same thing as I did before, but with this payment charge succeeded, I'm taking the data as the Stripe charge and I'm passing it into this new method I created called Dynamo Put. And so this is what creates the DynamoDB record that I was showing you earlier at the beginning of the video. So I created this utility function. It just takes these values in, and then it runs this put item input. And this is kind of a weird syntax if you never used DynamoDB before, but this is telling it's strings, these are numbers, and it's creating the record. And then I run this, I put it all in this params, and then I put the put item command. And by the way, names like this is passed in. But if we look back at the webhooks, this one, these values right here are all coming from the secrets manager. So we have the secrets manager here, and this, well, there's two things here. Some of these are coming from environmental variables that we set up when we created the lambdas, and then the real secret information is being pulled from secrets manager. And so that's how we get it. And these are passed into the utility that we just saw. So that's it. This creates everything that you need for a backend. You can do a lot of this similarly if you're using Amplify CLI, but I thought this was an interesting way of handling it. And if once you understand how to create infrastructure code using CDK, it's really, really powerful. So let me know in the comments below. Hope you learned something. The reason I might want to use the CDK over other technologies is now I have the ability to destroy this. I have the ability to create it at any time. I can swap out things easily. I can create a development environment, a production environment. It's so flexible using something like CDK to create your backend. It just takes a little bit to understand the syntax, but it's really powerful. Let me know what you guys think. Thanks.